I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I have been reading Edwidge Danticat for decades. And I take so much pleasure in saying that. She has 2 National Book Award nods, one for fiction, one for nonfiction. She's been an Oprah Book Club pick. She has a MacArthur Genius Grant. I mean, all of the things. But more importantly, Edwidge has written some of my favorite novels and story collections and a memoir that I will never forget, along with some essay collections. And there's a new essay collection called We're Alone. And Edwidge, I'm so happy to see you.
Oh, I'm so happy to see you. Like I am a book interview nerd. I'm one of the original watchers of book TV, and I watch you all the time. So this is extra exciting for me.
Oh, thank you for that, Edwidge. But hey, can we start with the title of the new book? Because We're Alone feels a little, I don't know. I feel like it's a wink and a nod, right? We're alone when we're reading, but we're not, because we're with the author, we're with the ideas, we're with the characters. How do we get to We're Alone?
Well, it's really funny because yesterday I was talking to a really good friend about the book, and I said, it's called We're Alone. She's like, we're alone, and our ancestors are not with us, and but we're not with each other. It's kind of depressing. But I said, no, it's not quite that. We're alone is, for me, at least in the context of this book, of course, we know that, they're saying no one's coming to save us, but it's not we're alone in that way. It's we're alone in the way that, in that very intimate way that we're together when we're reading. So we're alone with the author. So, I was a very shy little girl and surrounded by really vibrant and excited storytellers that I would watch in awe, like all storytellers. And I love that. And it's really influenced my writing. But I remember the first time I was given a book and it was all mine. And I thought, I can go in the corner and sit with that. And I just felt like that person was speaking directly to me and only to me at that moment. So we're alone in that context. We're alone together in the way that we're alone with the writer when you're reading them.
And sort of famously, your last story collection, Everything Inside, took you 13 years to sort of get to a place where you wanted to release the stories as a collection. How long did it take to put this new essay collection together? Was it a similar timeline, or is it kind of like, well, I think this is ready to go sooner?
Yeah, it's a shorter timeline. As you know, for folks who write, like if you write occasional essays or if you write a short story now and then, you get to a point where you think, okay, I might have enough for a collection, but I definitely should resist that temptation of like throwing everything I have there. And then you get to that point to where like, okay, are these things with essay collections, like do these things, will they still work now? So there was a point, I think about 4 years worth of work, but I started compiling last year fully and then, taking things out and then rewriting some things because, it's the same person, it's the same thought process. So sometimes it can get repetitive. And I did want to give people a sense that it was like collected works from this year to that year. So a lot of the essays are rewritten and some things are merged and blended. And I really love that journey because I think it brings not just the essays of today to the point of compiling, but also things that you might be thinking about differently, things that you might want to revise. So it's like another opportunity to put also these pieces in conversation with one another.
You love short stories the way I love short stories.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering what you get from writing essays that you don't get from a story. Beyond the obvious, obviously, we're talking fiction versus non. Let's take that out of the equation. Let's talk about the form for a second. What do you get?
The essay, you get immediacy, the sort of luxury, I would call it, of working with existing material. So then what you're really wrestling with is form, structure, order, kind of like, what should I actually say? What should I take out? And that whole process of learning what you think really as you're writing it and being open to that possibility of like, oh, maybe this is not as clear as I thought. you do get some of that in fiction as well. But I think the essay, there's a vulnerability to it that at every sentence, especially in the climate where we are now, where you know you're going to get like instant response as soon as the thing is out there. So I think there's that sort of that extra vulnerability. And there are things that sometimes, especially deeply personal thing, I think, oh, I don't want people commenting what is some aspect of my life. So I'm not sort of more like the commentary stuff, but sort of the deeply personal stuff that you sometimes are like, oh, do I want to write about this thing because I just don't want to hear like 100 opinions about like in response to it, like this deeply personal thing. So the essay offers that vulnerability. And I think it also pushes for me personally, like it pushes me in a direction that's less comfortable for me. That in the end, like when I reread things, like maybe 5 years from now, it's like, I'll be like, oh, I'm glad I wrote that.
I'm just, as you were talking and I was listening to you, I was thinking about the response when Breath Eye's Memory first came out. You were kind of getting it from all sides. And there were members of the Haitian community who were kind of like, well, why are you telling this story? This is what? And the world was really different. The internet was not what we know now. So you weren't getting immediate feedback unless you were at an event and then someone would come up and just, I remember some of the stories. And one of the things I love about your work, whether it's the essays or the short stories or the novels, is that you are always working off of story first, right? Even an essay has a story structure. Mm-hmm. There is a point to the thing that isn't just the vulnerability. It isn't just the immediacy, but it is always the story. And you've always said that your best writing teachers were the ones who were coming out of an oral tradition, your aunts, your grandmothers, like they knew how to tell a story. And I'm sorry I missed out on that because I love listening to people who really, I had a godfather who really like, that man could tell a story. And I was like, hi, more stories, please. But there is something to, and I don't think it's just being a Haitian writer. I think, lots of writers from diaspora communities find this, where you've got people on multiple sides saying, well, what do you mean? How is it possibly like this? Why are you saying this? And there's an ownership that I'm not sure belongs outside of the writer, if you know where I'm going with that. How do you decide what you're willing to give up and exchange with people you don't know? Essentially, once you put a story out into the world, right? You put a piece of writing out into the world, people respond.
Well, I tell especially young people when I speak in schools, and they'll say, what is the real interpretation of this, right? Like they always want to know the definitive interpretation or answer to a question in a story, not a novel, once the thing is out, it's yours. It's yours to interpret. It's yours to do with, whatever you like to see it, whatever way you want. And so I that's fine. Probably in the writing, in the process itself, I feel somewhat fearless. Well, I just have to write it because that's how it's coming to me. It's just afterwards you have the jitter. It's like, oh, whatever, what's going to happen now? But the freest I feel is when I'm writing something, because I feel like there's a sense that I'm writing it because it feels necessary to me to be written. And the sharing is a choice, ultimately. So I don't really hold back in the sense, except you, or you have those conversations with, if it's about someone you love, right? And there are things even in the book, I was like, oh, I didn't check with my cousin. and then, but I'm like, oh, maybe I'm glad I didn't in a way, because that might have, shifted sort of the purity of like the way that things came out and the way that I want to say it. So sometimes, I had a teacher who used to say, sometimes you ask for forgiveness rather than permission. And I think there's a lot of that in writing, sometimes writing about others, especially. And so, but that thing is saying the ownership of the community, I remember having this experience too of like writers from immigrant communities who I love, and I love to go to the first person from my community that I would meet and say, "Don't you love so and so?" Or they're there, like, and watch as they roll their eyes because they feel like, and I'm sure people do that with me because they feel like that person is not, maybe didn't tell their specific story, right? Like maybe it's a different experience. Maybe they don't approve. So I think that happens to all of us in that. But that's where it's so, for me, it's very, very exciting. You know, that time breath ice memory that we talked, you mentioned, they weren't many of us around. Now there are, not nearly enough, but there are many more Asian American writers. And so like that really takes the burden of like having to tell everybody's stories. So I think the answer to that is more people from that community telling more stories.
No, I can't. I cannot agree more. I mean, part of it for me too is what I'm looking for is always language first. And so for me, language is essentially voice, right? That's the first thing I'm looking for. But as a reader, I don't need my experience, the details of my experience to line up with whatever I'm reading. I need the emotional truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I need that sort of connection to someone who isn't necessarily, like, I mean, honestly, John Cheever covered New England really well. There are a lot of writers who've done the like Wapshaw Chronicle. I use that as a handbook. I used it as a handbook when I was growing. I was like, how do I explain where I am? Okay.
And we were all taught Cheever for like even writing programs for plays.
Right.
Yeah.
Those I do, honestly, I prefer the short stories now. But again, like Wapshaw, not so much Wapshaw Scandal, but certainly Wapshaw Chronicle. I used to be able to recite the last paragraph of that book because it's Leander's letter to his sons. And it's such a great riff on just being in the world. And now, of course, it's fallen out of my head. But if you haven't read it, go read it. I do want to talk about influencers for a second because there's this great essay in the new book, We're Alone, where you bring together Baldwin, Garcia Marquez, Polly Marshall, Toni Morrison, Lorraine Hansberry, Zora Neale Hurston. I mean, some really formative influences for you and a lot of other writers, but the flow of this piece and sort of the swing of this piece is really great. It takes you from your high school into sort of the present day. And one of the connections you make is between Salman Rushdie and Garcia Marquez, because Rushdie was always like, well, 100 Years of Solitude, Garcia Marquez, it feels a lot like how I grew up in India. And you were like, of course, because when you live in that liminal space, right, like magic to me is just kind of like, well, it's great, but it's not extraordinary. Can we go back and play with that for a second? Because I think that's really important. Like there's this idea, right, that magical realism only belongs to a certain place. And I think technically, yes, if you look at the literary tradition and whatnot, but I love this idea that it's something that cuts across cultures.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, absolutely. And I loved your interview with Rusty on for Knives, right?
Yeah,
You covered,
it was fun.
Like so much. That was an amazing interview. We did right. I think a couple of years before Garcia Marquez died, you ended a tribute to him, and I was there. Rusty was there. The Cecily Bowman and other writers were there. And I remember I had always had that feeling reading Garcia Marquez, especially the short stories, because I love short stories. And he does also like really so much with the form. And I think it's a form of this that people don't talk about enough. And they sometimes are very short, but it's almost like the stories you're told, like all stories. And so I remember when Rusty said, well, I was like, exactly, because there's so many things that, growing up in India, I was told they still were, like just really, as though they were some of the day's news, and especially, when I did spend the summer with my relatives in the countryside, it wasn't naive. It was just part of just like the stories of life and the stories we tell ourselves to understand our environment, spiritual beliefs, but also things were like, oh, of course, like this happened, of course. And that whole, the tradition of magical realism also came apart, a segment of it was, Eileen Carpentier talks about it's in the kingdom of this world, and, others who have gone before into Haiti came out of this writer's externality who talked about this merveilleux and this tradition in which it was such part of daily life, like extraordinary events of good or good or bad was such a common part of ordinary life that it just was part of our storytelling. So for me, it was like sitting there hearing that, to see like that journey, Rushdie, Golden, Marquette, and then they're all talking about this. And, that to me was really beautiful and powerful.
Part of it for me, too, also is the evolution of canon. I mean, if you think about, and you sort of riff on this a little bit when you're in high school, we all go through the Shakespeare stuff. No disrespect to Shakespeare. I get it. But, Lorraine Hansberry and A Raisin in the Sun. And yes, you had a classmate who watched the television version and Sidney Poitier's in it. And of course, he's an island guy. And of course, who wouldn't want to watch Sidney Poitier in Raisin in the Sun at any time? But I love the idea, though, that your classmate's response was, well, why can't we study this?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't we have a greater evolution of canon? I mean, there's stuff that I get and I look at it and I'm like, well, shouldn't it evolve, though? Shouldn't we be teaching a broader range of voices? And it still feels like we get stuck in gear. I mean, when you were first publishing in the 90s, it seemed like there was a lot of that energy happening kind of on a more regular basis. I was a baby bookseller as you were starting your career. Yeah, we were babies. We were babies. And we're still here, which is kind of exciting.
That's amazing.
But yeah,
Still here.
But thinking about it, right? Like a lot of that energy has gone into YA publishing, which is great. And you've done a lot of middle grade history and also some YA.
I've done YA,
yeah. And I love the idea that you're writing for a range of voices, right? Because I mean, when you and I were coming up, right, there wasn't really YA. You kind of went from the kids section straight to reading really inappropriate adult stuff because why not? It was there. And then eventually you got to the thing, right?
Yeah, you went from like Judy Blume's like the Margaret books to like Wifey.
Yep, because someone's mom had it. You were like, okay.
And you passed around that copy. It was like, okay, I liked it even.
But I do love the idea that there's sort of a different energy coming into publishing for smaller people, the small set, right? Whatever that range of age you want to call it, but also YA, where we can meet readers sort of where they are. But I get really excited when I can connect with someone who didn't, grow up in a suburb of New England, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't need reaffirmation of my experience. I like knowing that I'm part of something that's a lot bigger than me. And sometimes I get that in a short story. Sometimes I get that in a moment where I'm reading about someone there's a story, I think it's in Everything Inside. And it's this young woman from Haiti who is called because her father is dying in the United States and she's never met him before.
In the old days. Yeah. Right.
Oh, okay. In the old days. It is one of the best stories I've read by you, but it's so delicate and so smart. And yes, it is maybe not the happiest story, but it kind of is.
Mm.
Can we talk about the evolution of that story for a second? Because it's appeared in a couple of different iterations, I feel like. So it feels like something you've been playing with over time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it represents a lot of what you've been doing sort of long-term over your career.
So first of all, I wanted to give all praise to YA. I love YA. I think there's so much excitement in that space, including from my friend Izzy Boy, who's written some amazing YA and others, and Isabella Savant. There's just so much wonderful YA out there, and I love the pushing of genres, and so yay YA. In the old days, you're so right that this, and not like all the stories and Everything Inside was like that. all the stories are different in the version in the book than they were when they were first published. And in the old days, most of them all, because it's a story, for me, it was an evolution like of dealing with a very specific reality of this idea of like abandoning the dream of return. So there's a point, when we were growing up, when so many people knew in our community during the dictatorship who had left during the dictatorship, like my parents had left during the dictatorship in in the 70s, and others who had left later. But there was always that idea that one day I'll go back when the dictatorship ends. And a lot of people were fighting for that. And then suddenly it was, the 80s. And then I saw that, like, this sort of conversation in families where people were like, well, my life is here. And then others were like, yep, I'm packing up and I'm going. And in our community, there are a couple of families that split, that they separated them. The father went back to reclaim land to restart a life, but then the mother was like, well, I'm staying with the kids and you can, so that's something that I saw evolve. And I saw a moment, in my parents' church where this shift happened, like a massive shift where, in addition to that, but if people died here, my dad was a Deep Women's Church in Brooklyn, and every single death at some point was like, you had the service here, but they were going to be buried in Haiti. And then I remembered when I was in high school that one day where someone died in Haiti and the body was brought here. And I was like, oh, like it felt to me like, okay, we're in this whole different space in terms of return. So yeah, so that story for me was like addressing that and like the aftermath of that. So like if I these different families and in the story, Nadia, the narrator by Senna, so like an immigrant child, like a very sick, her mother's labors paid off, but she just didn't know her father, this other side of her family. The shift, because we early, like in Breathi's memory, was like the earliest stages of immigration. And I feel like in everything inside, I'm trying to address like the later stages of immigration that my nieces, like this next generation of my family that I'm seeing evolve are how they're dealing with immigration. So, just like part of the longevity, like in book selling of it, that allows you sort of this long view of being able to travel works with that.
It's the long view and also the interiority of the characters. That's the one thing that when I'm reading, whether it's the memoir or, Art of Death, which hopefully we'll get to at some point in this conversation, which is a craft book essay collection. But when I'm reading you, I feel like I recognize people I have never before met. And when I'm reading sort of that push-pull, like your characters some of them are looking backwards to what they've left. And they're also trying to look forward at the same time, but they're not necessarily in the exact, they're like two states of being, right? It's past and it's future. And then you bring up the next generation where they're like, no, we're right here. Like they're not particularly interested in the past. They're definitely interested in the future, but they also are just like, I'm here right now. My feet are on the ground. I know what I'm doing. You have to let me do the thing. And I love that tension when you're putting it in front of me because I get beautiful sentences, even if things are terrible. I mean, things go wrong. I get beautiful sentences out of it. So I can sit and stay with the language, and that helps me process the image that comes with the language. And I'm not just thinking of Brother, I'm Dying, your memoir of your uncle and your dad, but I do think of Little Edwidge. Your uncle had throat surgery and couldn't speak, and you were actually in Port-au-Prince with him, sort of being his voice. I mean, you had some cousins who did it too, but the idea of you translating, I mean, that is part of sort of the American immigrant narrative, right? The small person who's translating for their parents who's having a hard time. But you were doing it from jump because of a physical limitation that your uncle had. And that has really stuck with me, because the idea of you being an observer and watching the adults so you could interpret. But your uncle is like a leader in the community. He has to leave because he's been targeted by gangs. And here's tiny Edwidge translating at the bank, among other places. And how much of that you've always known you wanted to be a writer, right? Like since you were small.
Yeah, since, my uncle's story, so he left much later when I was an adult, but
right.
But this is my uncle, Joseph, who raised me while my parents were in the U.S. from the time I was 4 to the time I was 12. And he had throat cancer. He had surgery in the U.S. and went back to Haiti and used this voice box. But before he had the voice box, because that was to us like a big technology at that point. Before I had the voice box, we would have to either used to accompany him places, to the bank, to his errands. And people had never seen someone, like, they used to make fun of him, like a little strange, but he had such dignity. And watching that up close, and also having to write letters sometimes for him or some of my relatives, I feel like was also part of my training as a writer. It's interesting, and kids who translate for their parents here, like, and I had to do it too, you get this extraordinarily intimate view of the difficulties of an adult life so early. It's things that they would never confide in you, but they would say, write this in this letter, or tell this person this thing, or the doctor's telling you things. They don't do that anymore because of, I think that's a burden that's been taken off of immigrant kids, thankfully, because they're professional translators. But it's very, like, I remember being told by a doctor, when I was 15, I went to the doctor with my mother, and the doctor was like, her blood pressure is high. Tell her she doesn't, like, sit here and get this IV. She might die on the bus. And my mother was like, no, I have dinner to make. And then, like, I remember getting on the bus with my mother and watching her so carefully, like, to make sure. Then it's like, oh my God, don't drop dead. Like, the doctor just told me to tell you, like, shit. And then getting on, like, lie down, I'll make dinner, So having, like, these very things that I think other parents like us, like, would totally protect our children from, but having, like, really close access to. In a way, it was one of the, I think was definitely part of my training as a human, but also I think part of my training as a writer.
Writers really do live in that liminal space, though, in a way that no one else does. You're in the here and the now and the then and the there, but also you're living you're sitting in a space between life and death. In some cases, there's nothing quite to compare, right? And there are other pieces where you talk about the separation between parent and child. And I'm going to bring in Claire of the Sea Light for a second, which was your 2013 novel, which I'm quite fond of. And I really like Claire, and I really like her dad, and that community. But the idea that separation is inevitable in a way, right? Whether it's for economic reasons or literal life and death. But I'm wondering if you feel like now, with the body of work that you have, because again, you've written for little people, you've written YA, you've written for adults, you've written fiction, nonfiction. I mean, you've edited essay collections and short story collections. Do you feel like you've bridged that gap of separation? Do you feel like you have a better understanding of what it means to be a human who's separated from whatever might be the thing, whether it's community or home or family? I mean, separation comes in so many different forms.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I did. I was like, I'm done with that. So grasped it until I started writing like the last essay in this book, and We're Alone. And my daughter Mia started writing essays. It was taking, of course, with the wonderful writer Erica Cardwell. And Erica had, the course description was, imagine the essay as a body of water. And then my mother, started finding things of my mother's over the pandemic, when you're in the front of the house looking for things. And then I started talking to my daughter about it. And this memory of my mother and my daughter in the airport, because my one of my first childhood memories is of being at the airport with my mother when she was leaving the New York and airports. I was been nicknamed separation. I just traveled was near separation. And so just then I realized, oh, I dealt with that. I dealt with it with Claire Bissini, because people would tell me, their friends would say, Claire, you're Claire, and that's your mom. Like, I feel like that's how you're addressing with separation. And so I think I find that now, looking at it through the lens of not just being a daughter, but also being a mother. That's why I'm so grateful to Erica's notion. And this book really flows, if you forgive me the pun, around this idea of the essay as a body of water, because it's sort of like, you enter into it, like you see experience differently through different lenses of different spaces where you were in your life. So I feel like Claire was a different version of me that has been now being explored. It's like as a parent, what that would be like, and also better understanding the choices that my mother made and the difficulty of it, because there's so many people around the world who have to make that choice with their children and have to give their children in wraps, who will have to, walk through the daring gap, like through dangerous circumstances with their children, all in the hope of giving them a better life. And I think my parents did a different version of that. And there's so many more and more, there's so many people making this difficult decision. So I think of writers, and you were saying, writers fight for this space, but I think it's also a shifting space where you're like, look how many said, like, we all have three really stories, but we're looking at them through different lenses at different moments in our lives.
Evolution is a nifty thing. Really, pardon me for being queen of the obvious for a second, but the idea that you can look back on your work from different points and just sort of say, okay, I recognize the Edwidge who wrote that book or that story. Children of the Sea, right? It's. I think it's the first story in Krak.
Mm-hmm. It is.
And Krak was a finalist for the National Book Award. And my copy is so banged up.
Oh, I love to see the banged up copies.
I have a clean copy on the desk here, but my personal copy. I'm an active reader. What can I say?
You kind of have to be for this work.
Yeah, a little bit. But again, Children of the Sea it's a harrowing story, but it was a really early story for you to write. I mean, this was, 2 years after Breath, Eyes, Memory. So were you writing the stories at the same time you were writing that first novel, or was it all just sort of a piece and things came as they came kind of thing?
Oh, yeah. I was writing the stories when I was a student at Barnard.
Okay.
And I would, and the novel at the same time. But the stories, and I think that's why they have sort of like this urgent, a less sort of patient flow, let's say, because I was a French literature major, and so I would read these books that were blowing my mind, and then, but I was also like right before seeing a final, like in economics, so a lot of these other required classes, but I'm like, oh my gosh, all this Peter Deerfer story. Like writing stories for me was a kind of productive procrastination when I was in college. I tell college students, including my daughter, like, I don't recommend that, but it was just so that story started. I had the idea when I was in college, but then at some point when I went to Bordeaux for graduate work, there was a budging patient community there, and someone came to the school and said, we're getting this new group of people who are coming, who came by boat, including some children, and we'd like some Creole speakers to spend time with them. And so I just remember spending time with some of the families and especially the children. And I would ask, I was very curious, like, what was it like I was curious about the day-to-day, like how we spend that time on the scene and just the day-to-day, the logistics and such. And I would ask, we would have this conversation go. And then I started writing that story. I started writing, and I thought of it as like, how about, making it in a way that you tell a story of the person who has left or the person who is phase behind. But, one of the other things that was a common great thing, and I was, where I came to the U.S., my dad, who was in the church, they used to visit people who were in detention at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And every once in a while, they would take, I would go with my dad. And when we would meet people there, they would say, the important thing that he kept saying, like, what I need this person, they would have a phone number, right? Because that's one of the things that the families in Providence would say to that. And they would come here, and that's still the case where people come to the southern border, they're told it's like they have a number, someone to call. And that person is like, I need that person to know that I'm alive. I need them to know that I made it. If you can call this person to me. So that was a threat that carried from like the time I was a teenager to then suddenly seeing all the different variations of that, from the Children of the Sea for me is, to the last story and everything inside is without inspection. There is a continuing thread of that as to that story as it's emerging right now as we're speaking.
Knowing that we're recording experiences and voices that had not necessarily been taken seriously. Going back to Brother, I'm Dying, I mean, a lot of that memoir you were able to write because you had a FOIA request in, which is a Freedom of Information Act request in about your uncle's detention. And some of the details of that become the memoir. But if you hadn't had a FOIA request, you never would have had the information that you had. You're reliving all of this as you're putting the details down. Plus, your dad is dying and you are pregnant for the first time with your oldest daughter. Edwidge, that's a lot. That's a lot. How do you sit and create that narrative?
It was a lot, but as people who go through, the different types of experiences know, you kind of focus on the day-to-day, like one foot in front of the other, one day at a time. At that time, that's kind of how I was functioning. And I didn't immediately start writing because there were also so many practical things. And that request, thankfully, was done for me, on my, on our family's behalf. An investigation is requested by a group in Florida called American Children of Land Justice, who is a wonderful group that, I've been, associated with for a very long time. And so getting, clarity, getting information from my family, from my father who was dying, was initially of the utmost importance, like just because I was my uncle's own family member in Florida. So, and my husband and I were not allowed to visit him. So we didn't know what happened. We didn't know how he died. And so getting the medical records, and initially the first version we got was completely redacted. I was like, okay, you want it? We'll give you like this like patches with like nothing, basically. It's like basically with the title stamp and an initial, and eventually once the the investigation was started, then we could actually see the report. And using that, like I really wanted to I remember the like initial reviews of the book, like was like she like writes coolly and meets us fuming, and like it's like the perk, like as if the person wouldn't need a fume. But I really wanted to, and like I wanted to write something that would honor my uncle, because he also wanted to write a book. That was like his goal in his whole life. It was like, I want to write about his experience in Bel Air, which was this transporting neighborhood, about becoming a minister. He really wanted to write about his surviving cancer. So I wanted to write a book that would honor him. And part of that was knowing how his last days were spent in that request. And I'll tell you one thing about the government, though. Once they are allowed the records, they're very good record keepers. At least in this case, the records had things from like, oh, we gave him potato chips at 9:15, like everything. And then once I got the medical records, I was able to have many doctor friends of mine review them, because I just didn't want to say, oh, my uncle's mistreated. I really wanted to build a case. And later on, I would meet, there was a congressional hearing, there was a 16 minutes, 2-part series. And I got to meet other families who had gone through the same thing. And our experiences were surprisingly similar in terms of the mistreatment, not just in detention, but also the lack of medical care.
You knew, though, that was always going to have to be a long-form book, that story of your dad and your uncle. There was no way that was going to be an essay. It needed space. We needed time with your dad and your uncle and the rest of your family. But Clara the Sea Light, if I remember correctly, Clara the Sea Light started as a short story?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was in the Haiti Noir anthology, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, with the project.
Yeah. It's such a great series, though. Buffalo Noir.
Oh, I love that series.
It's really fun. So yay, Akashic. Thank you for that. But I just want to talk about Craft for a second, and I do want to use Claire, because when did you write the original story that became Claire?
2013.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it did evolve then pretty quickly, because wait, Claire pubbed in 15? When did Claire come out?
And then earlier than that. I'm not sure of the date, but there was some distance to the original story. And on it, because literally it was before, because the series was published kind of right after the earthquake, like 20.
Great. Okay, and the earthquake was 2010, right?
2010.
Okay.
So yeah, it was all before, maybe really before 10. But I'm not sure. I wanted to try. This is also the beauty of the short story. That I wanted, when I started the original story, I was like, I want to try to tell this story backwards. Yeah. So, and sometimes, I get this notion, like without inspection, I thought, I want to tell the story of a man falling and the whole span of the fall. And so with the beginning of that story is I want to tell the story backwards, starting with this girl's 7th birthday and going through her whole life. So that was the original. And sometimes you look at these premise, but Claire came also emotionally. Emotional, birth of that story was I was watching this documentary about Haitian children who were adopted by foreigners. And then one of the parents who adopted the child said, they just don't see like parenting thing like we do, because it was like a just throwaway statement. But at the same time, I knew I have friends who had living parents but were placed in orphanages because their parents thought they would have a better opportunity at orphanage and visit they even had parents. They were living in this orphanage, which was kind of like it's a boarding place, but the parents were allowed to visit the family where they still loved them dearly, and that sacrifice, that it's sometimes hard to understand. Even as a child, feeling the sacrifice was made for sometimes, right? And so that was the emotional origin of Claire. And I was like, I want to tell this book's whole life, and I want to build this relationship with her father. And then as time was going, I was like, I want to tell the story either of this village. And it's the same with the New Breaker, where these books that start with a larger story, or the Farming of Bones, which started with the story called 1937 in Krik. When the story is over, I think, we want this part, and then it sort of expands from within.
Do we get a new novel sometime soon? Do we get a new
Yeah.
story collection sometime soon? I'm being a little
Yes,
greedy.
Oh, you
I mean,
did.
it's not like I don't have a body of work to choose from, but I mean,
Oh, yeah. You'll get I mean, I don't know how soon because I've been editing my novel. Like I have a novel, I have a draft, and I'm still in that glorious period where it's like I'm finished, I'm so happy, and then my beloved editor Robin Dexter, who I've worked with since my first beloved editor was Laura Muscat Soho. I've had two really like consistently helped me out, with Ethan and I agree with who I worked with. But long term editor Robin Dexter, and I said, like so I got my notes back with Rob, and I'm like, well, I never looked really did I get better. And so Robin, we worked together with Claire, since really the Dew Breaker and Every Cool Side. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know when it will be out, but I just also love being in the space of a new novel. I have a picture book coming out with Caucasia next summer. And picture books was so much joy. So yeah, you have these things to look forward to. I have them to look forward to as well. Yeah.
Lots and lots of good stuff. Polly Marshall was a great influence and a personal friend of yours, and I'm hoping we can bring her books back into the world. But you've also been a fan of Percival Everett's for more than a minute, and I'm pretty sure we've had conversations about Percival that date back. I'm quite enjoying watching James take over the world. I hope you are too. I mean, you've been yelling about Percival in every corner for forever and a day.
Yeah, I first, and I know both Percival and Danzy Senna, who are just wonderful, both wonderful novelists. I knew Danzy and Brooklyn, who kind of came up together in this sort of group of writers who sometimes hung out. And then Percival used to teach at Kalalu at this workshop, and was he's a great supporter of Kalalu. And I started really reading them then, and it's been amazing to see like the world is catching up. That's fantastic to see, and it shows too. I think I always say to people about the writers we admire. People working, they're working, and it's okay. It doesn't always have to happen one way. Like the person like he builds and the work is so important to him, and it's just been wonderful to see. And Danzy also has a new book coming soon.
Oh, Colored Television is so good.
Oh, I haven't.
It's so good.
I need to get my hands on that, and you need to have a chat with her.
Oh, we have one coming. I promise. We have one coming. But
right.
Colored Television is so
watching.
good. Caucasia is one of those books that's an absolute touchstone for me.
Yeah,
and knowing that this new book is going to help introduce folks to Caucasia makes me very, very happy. Which is how I feel about your work, too. I mean, when the last story collection came out, Everything Inside, my first thought was, there's other books, too. There are earlier books, too. And I love Everything Inside. Please don't misunderstand me. But the idea that there's a body of work that people can dip in and out of, or, if they have the short set in their house, as I call them, that there's Edwidge for them as well. I cannot think of you without smiling. I am so happy to see you.
Well, thank you. So I'm really thrilled to see you.
We're still here.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing.
Still here.
That's amazing. And Danzy's still in here, and Percival is still there. I mean, it's also wonderful that like the folks who we've been on the journey with for so long to see that, and to see like new things coming. And Julia Alvarez, I did a conversation with her recently with like the Cemetery of Stories came out, and she said, a writer's life or a writer's career, there's all these peaks and valleys and these ups and downs, and one of the things about being still here, 30 years on, and so like you take none of it for granted, and that's so important. Even like just being in good health to do the work, or still having people who lead. So conversation like these, I treasure and do not at all take for granted. And so I'm grateful to you for wanting to chat and for doing it.
Well, I'm really happy we get to share an orbit still. It just delights me to know. It just delights me to know it. Edwidge Danticat, thank you so much for joining us. We're Alone is the new essay collection. It's out now. And when I said there's a lot of backlist, no, really, there's so much Edwidge to discover. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Miwa. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.